Hey everyone, I'm Kyle Karras,
I'm Dana Galant.
Joe Bursley.
I'm Caleb Walsh.
and I think we should start off today by asking you guys. So, are you familiar with the idea of the anti-hero in sort of films and media? So, I have a question about the ethics of anti-heroes because it seems that the media likes to portray anti-heroes and kind of idolize them and make them look better when we all know that the trait of an anti-hero is that they do bad things. Do you think it's ethical that the media and viewers like to idolize these anti-heroes?
Um, I think from the standpoint of pure entertainment, I don't really have a problem with it per se, but if we're talking about morality of it, I think that it could cause some issues because if you think of examples like, I don't know if you guys have seen like Dexter on Netflix or it was on some channel, I don't know. But the whole plot of that whole show, he's the main character, is Dexter, and he is a sociopath and is also like a serial killer. So that kind of like instantly makes him like an anti-hero, but it kind of balances out because what he's doing is killing he's killing like people that deserve to die. So like he goes after like rapists and other murderers and people that aren't living morally themselves. So he's almost like he's acting like to clean the streets of people like him. But I don't, and so I think that could be a little confusing for people though about like what makes a good guy versus a bad guy. What do you guys think?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting a question to bring up just because, like, you want to write characters that have flaws, and anybody who's like making a fictional show is going to want to have, you know, a good character that is flawed at some point. And our part of the reason that we watch them is to see if they overcome those flaws. But then you have a lot of characters like the main character in Breaking Bad. I forget his name, but like there's a lot of people who really idolize what he does and think that he's this is so cool and all this kind of stuff. But the point of the show is that like he's not making the right decisions and he's like doing all of this bad stuff that ends up making problems for everyone around him and stuff like that. So it's like you know at what point do you have responsibility to make a more distinguished line between good versus evil as opposed to just saying like you know everybody's got good and bad parts and then let the viewer decide because sometimes the viewer may come to a incorrect conclusion about that.
Well, I think you're on the right track, Joe, because it comes down to intention. What is the character's intention for his actions or her actions? Um, if we look at Walter White from Breaking Bad, his intentions were good. He wanted to provide for his family after his cancer diagnosis. So he got into, the illegal meth selling business. And he kind of spiraled out of that, but his intentions initially were good. And I think we can also look at the titular character from V for Vendetta, V. Um, he plans to overthrow the government, which is obviously against the law, treasonous. But it comes down to he had to do it because the government was a big brother type, like just controlling everything. Nobody's happy. It's the government won't let you do anything. And his intentions were to free the people, which I think is the important part of this argument. An anti-hero who does things for bad reasons is a villain. We can look at someone like the Joker from Todd Phillips' Joker. At first, he is kind of this anti-hero. He has good intentions, but in the end, he becomes a villain because his intentions change. He wants to get back at the world and he wants revenge, which is a villain and not an anti-hero.
What would you guys categorize someone like Dexter, like I mentioned, or because that could I feel like be taken that I feel like that like really walks a really fine line of just being a villain versus like being an anti-hero based on like what he was doing for and then another example I had was like the birds from Ozark, which I don't know if anyone watched Ozark or watches Ozark. But that kind of has a similar-ish plot line to Breaking Bad, sort of. It just deals with like someone that was the main character, Marty, was laundering money through his financial firm for a Mexican drug cartel. And initially he was just doing it to like help his family out, and it was really innocent. But then things like spiraled out of control, and he's now had to do like a whole bunch of illegal stuff. And like had to move his family. And what's interesting about the Ozark example I thought of was that Marty was like really having this internal crisis with really not wanting to be involved with anything other than laundering the money. He didn't want to know the people. He didn't want to know what they were doing, why they were doing what they were doing. And then eventually it comes down to he ends up killing someone, which is completely out of like, it took a couple episodes for him to bounce back because that took such a big hit on him. And I wondered like if that might classify him as an anti-hero.
Well, I say I have to push back a little bit on the intention necessarily justifying the actions of the anti-hero, because I think that's one of the issues that people take with these anti-heroes being kind of like celebrated almost in the wider culture, is that they're taking bad actions in order to justify whatever good end goal or whatever good intentions that they may have. Like you said with Walter White, thank you for bringing up his name. I spaced on that, but his intentions were to get money to help his family out because of his cancer diagnosis. But that doesn't necessarily justify all of the crime and like the drug dealing and all of this kind of other stuff that he got caught up into necessarily. And so I think that one of the issues people take with people idolizing these bad people is that they think that the bad actions that they're taking are okay because they're doing it in a good way, and that's not always necessarily the case. And we should be wary of encouraging, even unintentionally through the media, of saying, listen, as long as your heart's in the right place, you can do more or less whatever you want. It doesn't make you that bad of a person. I don't think that's a good message that we want to send out, even if it's something that's not an intentional moral of the story.
Well, we have to look at it from sort of, there's two layers to this argument, if you want to think about it that way. There's the ethics of the people who are watching, and is it ethical to, make these things look happy or even ideal? And then there's the ethics beneath, where you just forget about the outside realm, the ethics of the characters within that world. So obviously there's some ethical, sort of, discrepancy between what's going on in that world. Obviously they're doing something that doesn't seem, you wouldn't want that happening in the real life. But I think where it's kind of hard to differentiate, but where we should try to differentiate, is the ethics of the fiction versus the ethics of just seeing it in the real world. Because I personally don't see too much of an issue if you want to paint this evil guy as the hero, as long as you understand that the audience is capable viewers and they're capable of making these distinctions, saying this isn't real. It should not affect how I act because I have my own code of ethics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think another thing I wanted to bring up or sort of touch on was that in terms of the morality of the people making shows like this or characters kind of like that, would be, is it okay to dramatize, let's just talk about, like, I didn't watch Breaking Bad all the way through, which is why I kind of am not talking about it as much, but that whole like kind of idea of like he like sold meth or whatever, he had a meth lab, and that kind of lifestyle is like incredibly dangerous. And I know that they like portrayed it that way to an extent, but also like the whole like all of the show was just like him getting so lucky, I feel like, and like escaping death on times when like he wouldn't have he shouldn't have like escaped death. So I feel like is it okay for producers to make shows like that might paint a false picture of what like a lifestyle might look like?
I think you hit a good point there, Dana, because these shows and movies work because the anti-hero makes a choice at one point to do the anti-hero act. The intention initially is good, but when you look at a lot of anti-heroes, it doesn't work out for them in the end. Walter White, it does not work out for him. V from V for Vendetta does not work out for him. Pretty much any time an anti-hero, makes that choice, it doesn't work out in the end. It's because they make that first choice, which is a very difficult choice, and most people wouldn't have the courage to make it or the stupidity. But so they make that choice, and then the reason they suffer is because they start to get into it too much. They make too many bad choices after that. So I think the beginning of the anti-hero is it's okay because they make that choice. It's a really tough decision, but in the end, it would have been all right. But then they just continue to make more decisions, and it piles on, and then it becomes, well, if I was in that situation, I don't think I would have done that because, whoa, that got them in a lot of trouble. So maybe I wouldn't have done that, and I would have went the other way, and then I would have been okay. So
then it has like the viewer kind of rationalizing in their head and sort of being like, oh, well, if he had done this differently, like he would have been fine. And then that kind of like normalizes it in a way, which I feel like is kind of less than ideal.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we have to acknowledge is as much as our own perception of our culture and our society influences the stories that we tell in the media, those stories then can influence the way we behave in society and the way that we act accordingly. And I don't know that there's a strong enough case that these stories just exist in a bubble and nobody takes them too seriously, because if nobody took them that seriously, then obviously we wouldn't be having this discussion. But I think there's enough evidence that people can get influenced by these stories and by these characters and potentially see justification for bad actions that shouldn't have any justification and maybe don't have an in-universe justification, like with Walter White. Like in the show, it's portrayed as him breaking the law and he's doing all these bad stuff, but it's also like he kind of makes it out okay in a lot of situations. And a lot of people might say, oh, well, there's not really that much wrong with selling meth to pay back your debts or finance your family when you're down on your luck and stuff like that. I don't know if that's necessarily, if there's a responsibility on the writers to try and be more conscious with the kinds of characters that they write and understand that, people might be taking different messages than what the intended message was from the media or whatever, or if there's just, we should all as citizens be better at, being able to distinguish, oh, this is just fiction. We shouldn't actually be taking any of this that seriously, and we should just live our lives according to that and just let the media be fun stories that we tell each other. I don't know if we can necessarily say that everyone's going to be able to do that, though.
Right.
I think that a lot of what you're saying when people are getting affected by these shows, I think a lot of it has to deal with intake and how much you frequent this genre of like anti-hero. Obviously, if you're one of the people that idolizes the anti-hero and you watch a whole lot, I feel like your brain could get affected by that quite easily. But, everybody that I know usually has some sort of healthy mix of different genres where they can have like the superhero that's actually the hero doing good, or like, Batman who doesn't actually kill anybody. So I think that's a good mix. And I always like to bring up Aristotle because he's one of my favorite. He has one of my favorite standpoints, and I want to look at it from a mean perspective. Let's say you have the two extremes, right? One extreme is don't ever show these anti-hero shows. They're bad. They're going to hurt minds of people. The other end of it is only show this. And that's where I see a huge issue where people would start to get their perceptions affected. I think that what we're doing right now, which is have a healthy market mix, a nice balance in the center, would be the Aristotelian mean in this situation. Show the healthy heroes, the anti-heroes, and there's plenty of other genres surrounding that too.
Well, Kyle, you bring up an interesting point. Someone like the character Batman, who is, he's a super good guy, he would never do anything bad. But then I look at the movie The Man of Steel, where in that movie, Superman commits the ultimate crime and kills someone for the greater good. What do we think about something like that? Is he an anti-hero, or is he just a hero that he made an ultimate decision?
That's kind of a good question, is to ask, like, what's the line between being a hero and anti-hero? Is it whether or not it just affects, like, the greater good? Which I think it would be. I think that if something that, the character does affects the greater good, that would just make them a regular hero, in my eyes. What do you guys think? Also, we're about like at 16 minutes, just so.
I guess I just have one more thought that I want to get out here, is that I think that I would personally take a little bit more of the Rawls veil of ignorance approach, where, who is going to be the most susceptible or the most affected, or the, I guess, weakest party, quote unquote, here. And I'd say that'd probably be younger kids, like, teenagers or adolescents, who are still kind of forming their opinions and their identities about the world, and their beliefs about what's right and wrong, and they don't always make the best decisions, as any of us can know since we were there like a couple of years ago. But take the show like Rick and Morty. It's kind of a weird show, but it's popular a lot with some younger adults or teenagers, and the character of Rick is a very, very morally gray at best character, to say the least, but a lot of people kind of idolize his sort of nihilistic approach on the world. And I don't know if that's necessarily something, like, for a grown adult who's like gone through a lot of stuff, and they can like watch Rick and say, oh, well, that's not a good character that you want to idolize. But for someone who's 13 or 14 or 15 and watching this show, they think, oh, that's a kind of cool outlook, and they don't know as much about the real world or all the responsibilities that you have to intake, and so they might actually think that's a legitimate viewpoint. I don't know if that's necessarily a good thing that we want to potentially impose. So we may need to think more about, like, if people who are younger are watching these things, what kinds of messages are they picking up?
So would you, Joe, agree with a Kantian rule to not allow any kind of, morally questionable decisions from protagonists?
I don't know if I'd be as strict to that Kantian rule, just because I think, there is obviously room for gray area where, like, you want to introduce characters who have to struggle with their morality. But I think when it comes to the point of, them making one or two morally questionable decisions, and then turning that into being a morally questionable character because they're doing it regularly, and you don't really know if they're really good or really bad or somewhere in between, like with Walter White or something like that, I think that causes for a lot of concern. So I wouldn't say I'm a hard yes on that Kantian rule, but I think that it leans closer to the direction that I'd be in favor for.
Well, I think that we've all put up some good arguments, and I think we've opened up our minds at least a little bit more to see the different sides of this argument. While we may not always agree, I think it was very beneficial. But I do think that's a great point to stop here, and we can discuss further offline.